All right, welcome back to the Modern Josephus. Are you guys all noticing something? Have you noticed it? Can you hear it? Yeah, baby. I got myself a microphone. And now, it sounds so much better. But still, if you think it could be better, leave it down in the comments and let me know. You know, if my voice, maybe I need to do some shuffling, but for me it sounds way better than it was before. But maybe some of you out there can fine-tune your ear and be like, hey, it needs a little bit more. So leave in the comments if that's the case. Anyway, today we're going to go ahead and look at the election of 1860 and the road to disunion. So I will probably agree with a lot what he says here, since I am a unionist, but we'll see. All right, and I may have some caveats here and there, but take a listen and let's see what opinion I give you.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we discuss one of the most confusing questions in American history. What caused the Civil War? Just kidding, it's not a confusing question at all. Slavery caused the Civil War. Mr. Green, but what about states' rights and nationalism, economics? Me from the past, your senior year of high school, you will be taught American government by Mr. Fleming, a white southerner who will seem to you to be about 182 years old, and you will say something to him in class about states' rights, and Mr. Fleming will turn to you and he will say, a state's right to what, sir? And for the first time in your snotty little life, you will be well and truly speechless.
Yeah, that's what I always ask when I talk to my southern friends. I always say, well, what was the state right about? What state right was going to be violated? There wasn't any. There was no state right that was going to be violated. Lincoln didn't believe in violating states' rights. He even said that they had a right to own slaves. He wasn't against the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment blocks the presidency, blocks Congress would block Congress from interfering in slavery in states unless an amendment is filed. Anyway, let's go.
The road to the Civil War leads to discussions of states' rights, to slavery, and differing economic systems, specifically whether those economic systems should involve slavery, and the election of Abraham Lincoln, specifically how his election impacted slavery, but none of those things would have been issues without slavery. So let's pick up with the most controversial section of the Compromise of 1850.
Yeah, slavery was the main issue, and it had been an issue since the founding. I mean, at the Constitutional Convention, South Carolina and Georgia weren't going to join unless they were allowed to keep their slaves. And so from the very beginning of the foundation of the country, there had been a struggle over slavery. And it had just metastasized all the way up to 1860. So it was about slavery. All this stuff about tariffs is all second-hand nature. And as we've seen, even some Southern Democrats approved, along with their Southern Democrat friends, to put tariffs either on the North or on the South.
The Fugitive Slave Law. Now, longtime Crash Course viewers will remember that there was already a fugitive slave law written into the United States Constitution.
I said that last video.
So what made this one so controversial? Under this new law, any citizen was required to turn in anyone he or she knew to be a slave to authorities, and that made every person in New England into a sheriff, and it also required them to enforce a law they found abhorrent. So they had to be sheriffs, and they didn't even get little gold badges. Thought people, can I have a gold badge? Oh. Awesome, thank you. This law was also terrifying to people of color in the North because even if you'd, say, been born free in Massachusetts, the courts could send you into slavery if even one person swore before a judge that you were a specific slave. And many people of color responded to the fugitive slave law by moving to Canada, which at the time was still technically an English colony, thereby further problematizing the whole idea that England was all about tyranny and the United States was all about freedom.
Okay, so they're talking, though, about escaped slaves who went to Canada. All right, your regular black American who's working as a whaler on a ship. in Massachusetts is not going to be fleeing to Canada.
But anyway, the most important result of the Fugitive Slave Law was that it convinced some Northerners that the government was in the hands of a sinister slave power. Sadly, slave power was not a heavy metal band or Britney Spears' new single or even a secret cabal of powerful slaves, but rather a conspiracy theory about a secret cabal of pro-slavery congressmen.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously there were every single congressman or at least not every single, but a majority of Southern congressmen and Southern senators were going to be pro-slavery. If not all of them, at least most of them. And all the Whigs from the North were going to be against it. But here's another thing. Even Northern Democrats were for keeping slavery, while Whigs who were slave owners like Scott or Taylor were for limiting the expansion of slavery, and they wanted to stop slavery from expanding, which again all comes back to the idea that if you stop slavery from spreading, you will have more free states who will be able to pass an amendment to end slavery.
That conspiracy theory is going to grow in importance, but before we get to that, let us discuss railroads. Underrated in monopoly and underrated in the Civil War. Let's go to the thought bubble. Railroads made shipping cheaper and more efficient and allowed people to move around the country quickly, and they had a huge backer, also a tiny backer, in the form of Illinois Congressman Stephen Douglas, who wanted a transcontinental railroad because, one, he felt it would bind the Union together at a time when it could use some binding, and two, he figured it would go through Illinois, which would be good for his home state. But there was a problem. To build a railroad, the territory through which it ran needed to be organized, ideally as states, and if the railroad was going to run through Illinois, then the Kansas and Nebraska territories would need to become state-like, so Douglas pushed forward the Kansas...
So he has his little Thomas the Train there. Wow, so this was his idea and Lincoln just borrowed off of it. Interesting.
Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act formalized the idea of popular sovereignty, which basically meant that white residents of states could decide for themselves whether the state should allow slavery. Douglas felt this was a nice way of avoiding saying whether he favored slavery. Instead, he could just be in favor of letting other people be in favor of it. Now, you'll remember that the previously bartered Missouri...
But this, again, even though it sounds nice and everything, it was against what the Founding Fathers wanted, what most of them wanted. They were okay with these few little states, you know, at the bottom of the map here being slave states, but they didn't want it to spread out west. They wanted to limit it.
Missouri Compromise banned slavery in new states
because they wanted slavery to end. But then came along John C. Calhoun, and not only did he not want it to end, but he said it was beneficial and helped to the slaves. Crackpot.
It's north of this here line. And since in theory Kansas or Nebraska could have slavery if people there decided they wanted it under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, despite being north of that there line, this in practice repealed the Missouri Compromise. Yeah. As a result, there was quite a lot of violence in Kansas, so much so that some people say the Civil War really started there in 1857. Also, the Kansas-Nebraska Act led to the creation of a new political party. The Republicans. Yes, those Republicans. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So
Amen.
Douglas's law helped to create a new coalition party dedicated to stopping the extension of slavery. It was made of former Free Soilers, Northern anti-slavery Whigs, and some know-nothings. It was also a completely sectional party, meaning that it drew supporters almost exclusively from the free states in the North and West, which, you'll remember from like 2 minutes ago, were tied together by common economic interests and the railroad.
Yeah, even California went Republican.
You don't underestimate railroads. By the way, we are getting to you, Dred Scott. And now we return at last to slave power. For many Northerners, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise, was yet more evidence that Congress was controlled by a sinister slave power group doing the bidding of rich plantation owners, which, as conspiracy theories go, wasn't the most far-fetched. In fact, by 1854, the North was far more populous than the South. It had almost double the South's congressional representation, but in spite of this advantage, Congress had just passed a law extending the power of slave states, and potentially, because 2 new states meant 4 new senators, making the federal government even more pro-slavery. And
here's the reason. The Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats were both united on keeping slavery in the South, while the only party that was against slavery were the Whigs, later Republicans. So, you have a large majority versus a small minority.
And to abolitionists, that didn't really seem like democracy. The other reason that many Northerners cared enough about Kansas and Nebraska to abandon their old party loyalties was that having them become slave states was seen as a threat to Northerners' economic self-interest.
Well, not only that, but it also fundamentally went against the vision of the Founding Fathers, of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, who were even slave owners. Those men wanted to see slavery end, and these people just wanted to find ways to make slavery spread everywhere.
Remember, the West was seen as a place where individuals, specifically white individuals, could become self-sufficient farmers. As Lincoln wrote, "The whole nation is interested that the best use be made of these territories. We want them to be the homes of free white people. They cannot be to any considerable extent if slavery is planted within them. New free states are places for poor people to go to and better their condition." So the real question was, would these Western territories have big slave-based plantations like happened in Mississippi, or small family farms full of frolicking free white people like happened in Thomas Jefferson's imagination? So the new Republican Party ran its first presidential candidate in 1856 and did remarkably well. John C. Fremont from California picked up 39% of the vote, all of it from the North and West, and lost to the Democrat James Buchanan, who had the virtue of having spent most of the previous decade in Europe and thus not having a position on slavery.
Yeah, this guy was weak president. And basically useless the 4 years he was there.
I mean, let me take this opportunity to remind you that James Buchanan's nickname was the Old Public Functionary. Meanwhile, Kansas was trying to become a state by holding elections in 1854 and 1855. I say trying because these elections were so fraudulent that they would be funny, except that everything stops being funny like 12 years before the Civil War, and it doesn't get really funny again until Charlie Chaplin. Ah, Charlie Chaplin, thank you for being in the public domain and giving us a much-needed break from a nation divided against itself, discovering that it cannot stand. Right, so part of the Kansas problem was that hundreds of so-called border ruffians flocked to Kansas from pro-slavery Missouri to cast ballots in Kansas elections, which led to people coming in from free states and setting up their own rival governments. Fighting eventually broke out and more than 200 people were killed. In fact, in 1856, pro-slavery forces laid siege to anti-slavery Lawrence, Kansas with cannons. One particularly violent incident involved the murder of an entire family by an anti-slavery zealot from New York named John Brown. He got away with that murder, but hold on a minute, we'll get to him. Anyway, in the end, Kansas passed 2 constitutions because, that...
I will say more about John Brown when we get to him later.
That's a good way to get started as a government. The pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution was the first that went to the U.S. Congress, and it was supported by Stephen Douglas as an example of popular sovereignty at work, except that the man who oversaw the voting in Kansas called it a vile fraud. Congress delayed Kansas's entry into the Union, because Congress's primary business is delay, until another more fair referendum took place, and after that vote, Kansas eventually did join the U.S. as a free state in 1861, by which time it was frankly too late. Alright, so while all this craziness was going on in Kansas and Congress, the Supreme Court was busy rendering the worst decision in its history.
And for me, it's an unconstitutional decision.
Oh, hi there, Dred Scott. Dred Scott had been a slave whose master had taken him to live in Illinois and Wisconsin, both of which barred slavery, so Scott sued, arguing that if slavery was illegal in Illinois, then living in Illinois made him definitionally not a slave. The case took years to find its way to the Supreme Court, and eventually in 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney from Maryland handed down his decision. The court held that Scott was still a slave, but it went even further, attempting to settle the slavery issue once and for all. Taney ruled that black people, quote, had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro must justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
See, another slavery for his benefit. That's the best place where black people can be. He was from the South. So obviously, he didn't live in Massachusetts, where there were plenty of black men running around, working jobs, making money, becoming semi-successful, some even being in the middle class. And, I mean, you had Frederick Douglass, and yeah, he didn't have, he worked, well, he had his own printing press, so I guess, entrepreneur, and he had his own business, and he was in the middle class with a nice house. So obviously this Roger Taney never went up there and visited the North, apparently. And some states at the beginning, as I mentioned in previous videos, even allowed black men with property to vote. And I think even up to this time, there were some states that allowed it. I think like Massachusetts, Vermont, those New England states, I think allowed even black property men to vote.
So that is an...
I could be wrong. I'm not saying that that's what happened. But if I remember right, I think some states even continued it on.
The actual quote from an actual decision by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Wow. I mean, Taney's ruling basically said that...
If you read the dissent, I think there were 2 or 3 dissenters, very good opinions that they had. The dissenting opinion was very well written.
All black people anywhere in the United States could be considered property, and that the court was in the business of protecting that property. This meant that a slave owner could take his slaves from Mississippi to Massachusetts and they would still be slaves, which meant that technically there was no such thing as a free state. At least that's how people in the North, especially Republicans, saw it. The Dred Scott decision helped convince even more people that the entire government, Congress, President Buchanan, and now the Supreme Court were in the hands of the dreaded slave power.
Well, here's the thing. For most of the presidency, let's say from Jackson till right before the Civil War, most of the presidents were Democrat. And slave-owning Democrat who were looking to protect their slave operation. Their slave regime, as Robbie said on the Hill. So it just makes sense that they've been able to stuff, or not, I don't want to say stuff. I mean, they legitimately were able to put a whole bunch of pro-slavery judges in the Supreme Court, to where there were only 3 judges who were from the North. So, that's why it's very important to elect the right people as president, to have the right judges.
Oh, we're going to do the mystery document now? Stan, I am so confident about today's mystery document that I am going to write down my guess right now, and then I'm going to put it in this envelope, and then when I'm right, I want a prize. All I ever get is punishment. I want prizes. Okay, the rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document. I already did that, and then I get rewarded for being right. All right, total confidence. Let's just read this thing, and then I get my reward. I look forward to the days when there shall be a servile insurrection in the South, when the black man shall assert his freedom and wage a war of extermination against his master, when the torch of the incendiary shall light up the towns and cities of the South and blot out the last vestige of slavery. And though I may not mock at their calamity nor laugh when their fear cometh, yet I will hail it as the dawn of a political millennium.
Okay, let me guess. I'm gonna guess it's an abolitionist. I'm gonna say it's Frederick Douglass or the Lloyd guy. Lloyd Garrison, I think his name was, something like that.
I was right! Right here, guessed in advance, John Brown. What? Stan! Ohio Congressman Joshua Giddings. Seriously, Stan?
Okay.
Whatever, I'm going to talk about John Brown anyway. In 1859, John Brown led a disastrous raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to capture guns and then give them to slaves who would rise up and use those guns against their masters. But Brown was an awful military commander and not a terribly clear thinker in general, and the raid was an abject failure. Many of the party were killed, and he was captured, he stood trial, and was sentenced to death. Thus he became a martyr to the abolitionist cause, which is probably what he wanted anyway. On the morning of his hanging, he wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Well, he was right about that, but in general...
So here's my thing about John Brown. He was a murderer, alright? He murdered a whole family in Kansas. What he did at Harper's Ferry is something more legit, alright? You take up arms. Now, if he was going to arm blacks to go and kill other families, then he's wrong. But the confrontation between him and the federal troops, that's something that is more legit. At least they're being a man about it. Murder is very cowardly. Alright, to go in the middle of the night and kill people while they're asleep and they can't defend themselves, that's cowardly for men to do. You want to fight? Stand toe-to-toe with your enemy and fight it out, and whoever wins, wins. Alright?
General, any statement that begins I, comma, my name, yeah. And so the stage was set for one of the most important presidential elections in American history. Dun 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 dun.
And this is why abolitionism was not something I really care for, and Lincoln didn't care for the abolitionists either. A lot of times they were advocating for ending slavery by dictatorial-like ways, and you can't do that. If you want to end anything moral, you have to do it through the process of an amendment. All right? Until you can get an amendment through to establish a moral throughout the whole country, that means that now you have the majority of the country on board with that moral. Until then, it's got to be a state decision.
In 1860, the Republican Party chose as its candidate Abraham Lincoln, whose hair and upper forehead you can see here. He'd proved his eloquence, if not his electability, in a series of debates with Stephen Douglas when the two were running for the Senate in 1858. Lincoln lost that election.
Great speeches, though.
But the debates made him famous, and he could appeal to immigrant voters because he wasn't associated with the know-nothings. The Democrats, on the other hand, were, to use a historian term, a hot mess. The northern wing of the party favored Stephen Douglas, but he was unacceptable to voters in the Deep South.
The northern wing, meaning Northern Democrats.
So Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, making the Democrats the last remaining truly national party, no longer truly a national party.
And Breckinridge was actually vice president to Buchanan, and he'd end up leading a brigade, or maybe even up to a division in the Confederate Army.
A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, dedicated to preserving the Constitution, quote, as it is, i.e. including slavery, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln received 0 votes in 9 American states.
See, Abraham Lincoln, though, he also believed in letting slavery alone in the states. It wasn't just John Bell. Why? Because that's just a constitutional position. There's a 10th Amendment. You can't touch slavery in the states unless an amendment is passed ending slavery.
But he won 40% of the overall popular vote, including majorities in many of the most populous states, thereby winning the Electoral College. So anytime a guy becomes president who literally did not appear on your ballot, there is likely to be a problem. And indeed, Lincoln's election led to a number of southern states seceding from the Union. Lincoln himself hated slavery, but he repeatedly said that he would leave it alone in the states where it existed.
Yes, because the reason why it can't touch it, the 10th Amendment, and Lincoln understood the 10th Amendment.
But the demographics of Lincoln's election showed Southerners and Northerners alike that slave power, to whatever extent it had existed, was over. By the time he took office on March 1st, 1861, 7 states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, and the stage was set for the fighting to begin.
Here's what's interesting is there were at first, in total there would end up being 11, but as soon as he got elected, 7 left the Union immediately over slavery. What's interesting is if you read Bruce Catton's A Terrible Swift Sword, I think, or no, The Coming Fury. It's his first book in a 3-part series of on the history of the Civil War, and he writes about how there was this group in South Carolina who were slave owners who really wanted to just secede at this point. They were done with being in the Union. And they concocted, and they're the ones that encouraged Breckinridge to run for office. And because they on purpose wanted to split and wanted to secede. That's what they were. That was their end goal. So they get Breckinridge to run, splitting the Democrat vote. Had Stevens run alone, and these men hadn't formed this cabal, Douglas would have been the next president of the United States, and slavery would have lasted longer. But these hotheads from South Carolina were just fed up. They just wanted to leave the Union. All right, so they were just rabid secessionists. And I mean, come on, South Carolina didn't even want to join the Constitution at the beginning anyway, unless they had that guarantee of slavery. But so they leave the Union. But what's interesting is that 7 states left. But there were 4 states who ended up leaving later who still remained, and I'll get to them later.
Which it did when Southern troops fired upon the Union garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861. So that's when the Civil War started, but it became inevitable earlier, maybe in 1857, or maybe in 1850, or maybe in 1776, or maybe in 1619, when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. Because here's the
1619, no slaves arrived in Virginia. These were indentured servants, and one of them actually got freed, and he became the first actual slave owner because he got the Virginia court to make sure that that another indentured slave that came later would serve as his slave for life because he had disobeyed and run off and things like that. Put that in perspective.
In the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Taney said that black Americans had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
And that is something that is not true.
But this was demonstrably false.
Yes.
Black men had voted in elections and held property,
See what I told you? Do I know or do I not know?
Including even slaves. They'd appeared in court on their own behalf. They had rights. They'd expressed those rights when given the opportunity.
And there were several thousand black slave owners throughout the South. In South Carolina, there were a whole bunch of black slave owners. So why Taney would rule like this is beyond me. Unless he was like he must have been really super racist or really ignorant. I don't know, because I mean, you had a lot of black plantation owners with tons of slaves, and these black men would do business with the white folks there, and they'd go to the same parties and support the same candidates and give money to candidates and do all this kind of stuff. So where Taney got this idea is crazy.
And the failure of the United States to understand that the rights of black Americans were as inalienable as those of white Americans is ultimately what made the Civil War inevitable. So next week, it's off to war we go. Thanks.
I don't think that that's the reason, because again, like he said, in the South there were a lot of black Americans who were successful business owners, plantation owners, rich, wealthy, and had good relationships with the neighbors around them. So
thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Meller.
Anyway, we're getting good. What I wanted to say is that the other 4 states that didn't secede, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, the reason why they didn't secede at the time that the other states seceded was because slavery was a dying institution there. If you read about even Robert E. Lee, he had already been letting a lot of his slaves go just because it was too expensive for him. He wasn't able to take care of them anymore. I think the lands that he held were also smaller, things like that. So it was dying in those states. And in Tennessee, for instance, during the Civil War, eastern Tennessee, where there's the mountains and things, that tended to be a more pro-union side and very anti-slavery. And while the western part of Pennsylvania, Tennessee, where it's flatter and things like that, there were more opportunity to have slaves because plantations could be built there. But even then, they didn't have as many slaves in Tennessee as they did in South Carolina or Mississippi or things like that. It wasn't that predominant. North Carolina also, slavery was just dying. It wasn't, compared to their sister state of South Carolina, where it was like the main big deal. North Carolina, it wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah, you had plantations and things like that, but not as many as in South Carolina. And then Arkansas, when I read about Arkansas, I don't really think about plantations there. Maybe there were some. I haven't really investigated, to be honest, but it doesn't seem to me to be somewhere where there's a lot of plantations. So what I'm getting at is that those 4 states, they didn't secede until Lincoln called up the 75,000 troops after the firing of Fort Sumter. And had Lincoln not called up those troops, and I understand that he did have to do it, in my opinion, it was the right move to do. And we'll get into later probably about, constitutionality and things like that. And I'll do that in the next video. But the main point I want to say is that had Lincoln not called up 75,000 troops and looked for a different way to reconcile the whole situation, you would have seen those 4 states more than likely remain in the Union. For instance, even people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, didn't have a great fervor for leaving the Union, and they even thought that it was wrong for Virginia to leave the Union, but they said, "I'm going to protect my home state over anything else, because this is my state, this is my home." So had Lincoln not called up the 75,000 troops, I think at least two, for sure, 2 out of those 4 states would have stayed, and probably the other 2 as well, just because slavery wasn't that big of an issue as it was for the Deep South. Anyway, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, comment. I hope you all like this mic, and hopefully I'll bring another 10 more subscribers soon. Alright guys, we'll see you later. Thanks for watching.